Welcome back to the Amid Climate Academy podcast. A month ago, the ICIMOD, that is an institution in the Himalaya that promotes ecological development, was born in the 1974. So a month ago, they published their High-Wise report. It's a report about the situation of water, ice, society, and ecosystems in the Himalaya. And in this report, actually, they highlight a lot of very interesting things of what are the status of those. And we can see that glaciers has disappeared 65% faster in the 2010s than in the previous decade. Or on current emissions pathways, the 80% of glaciers volume will be gone by 2100. Those are just two of the highlights about this report, but today I'm very happy to have here with us two of the scientists that are working in the ICIMOD. We have Amina Maharjan. I hope I pronounced that well. She's the lead editor of the High-Wise report and lead author of the Society chapter at the ICIMOD. She's been working on the human impacts of what's happening in Nepal and what's the impact of this climate change to the livelihood of billions of persons that are kind of, their resources comes from the Hindu Kush mountains and its ecosystems. So, Amina, thanks to have you here. It's a great honor.
Thank you, Kilian, for having me in your podcast and looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, thanks. And in the other side, we have Jakob Steiner. He's a hydrologist. He's been working in the Hindu Kush Himalayas also for a very long time. He's focused now in the cryosphere, so the snow and ice science in Nepal before and now on Pakistan. So let's say he's a high altitude Hindu Kush Himalayas expert, and he's been the author of two of the chapters of the High-Wise when he's explaining about water and ice. He's been also specialized in the hazards that climate change is producing, and probably because he's born in the Alps and now living in the Kush, he can also talk with the similarities and the differences between these different ranges. So, Jakob, thanks for being here. A great honor.
Thank you, Kilian, for having me as well. And I'm looking forward to talk about mountains and the region here, especially in the next couple of minutes.
Yeah, thanks both of you. So to start, I have a question to Amina. I think when we talk about science and about the problems of the ecosystems, normally we talk from a occidental perspective. We are mostly looking on the effects that it's happening in Europe or in America, but probably the effects of climate change have been bigger and greater in countries like Nepal. And you have been seeing that for all your life. So what would you say it's or are you agree with this distinction that normally we are focusing from more of a occidental perspective and not really looking on what's happening in Nepal and probably more of the countries that they are around the equator to see, that probably the effects has been for much longer there.
Yes, I definitely would agree to your statement. If you look at the cryosphere, so cryosphere is the frozen world, ice, glaciers and all. Those are melting rapidly in this part of the world. And because people actually live very close to this cryosphere, the impacts are something we are not talking about, futures. People are living with those impacts. And people are actually already facing the losses and damages because of those changes. But, mountains have remained isolated for such a long time. Of course, it has also, attracted people because of that particular region. But because of that isolation, it is not that visible globally. So when we talk globally, then Hindu Kush Himalayas, have very small space, so to say. But then it's very important to understand that, impacts are there. Impacts are also, I'm not saying that it's not there in Alps or in ocean, in more global north countries, but capacities is what matters, because in the Hindu Kush Himalaya countries, the people's capacity or even the government's capacity to adapt or respond to these changes are very, very limited. And in that sense, like the impact becomes so much, the vulnerability is so higher in these regions, but then the kind of resources required is actually not there for the people to adapt to these changes. And no wonder now we see more and more people facing losses and damages and in a very distressful conditions, people even, leaving, abandoning their places and moving to new areas. That is extreme cases. But in most cases, people are trying to adapt to the changes, to the best of their ability. And this is something our chapter has highlighted, what we call autonomous adaptation. So which means to say it's nothing planned, supported by state governments, but something that the families or the community is doing themselves. So most adaptation is at that scale. Very few planned adaptation in this region. And this is why it is very important to really raise this issue also to a global audience. And we are very grateful to be in your podcast because that would be an audience that we normally don't speak to.
Yeah, no, thanks. And that's a bit the goal, like to reach audience and so people is aware about what's going on around the world. And you were mentioning that it's the adaptations that probably because the governments even don't have the capacity or the logistic side or on the economic side to make these adaptations. Either is the families that they adapt to all these changes, or it ends with migration, and is probably like we are seeing this migration either inside the countries or like going to other countries. Is how is the situation in Nepal or in the Kush countries about that? Is people moving mostly because like heat, on south parts, or is people like also like moving like from more rural areas because mountain hazards or because there's resources available?
I would say in general, people are moving out of mountain areas. That's the general trend. There are some exceptions, but in most of the areas, this is what we have seen. Now, to really say why people move, that's difficult. These decisions are very complex. People have to understand that when you move, not only one or two members, but the when family shifts, that's a very complex and difficult decision because you are basically leaving all your assets, all your resources, and what your social capital, everything else, and going to a new places and starting from the beginning. And that's never a simple decision for the families or the communities to make. And this is why most people, they try their best to stay where they stay. And only in very dire situation, actually, people move. Now, climate change is not the only factor why people are moving. There are also other developmental factors. When access to basic services like good education, good health services are not available, that also drives people to move. But what we see is increasingly climate change impacts are adding to that driver. So you have multiple drivers, and there now climate is one more addition to that driver. And in some cases where, the climate change impact has been so great that there is simply no way for people to be there. It could be a hazard like landslide, where you have lost your house, your land, everything else. What do? You just have to move out. That's the best you can do. Or it could be also slow onset, like some villages are running out of water, or a persistent drought for a number of years where you can't, slowly are running out of options to raise crops in winter, for instance. So that is also pushing people to move out. And as you rightly mentioned, majority of them are internal migration, so within the country, very short distances, and that's why it's not visible. Unless you go and dig, it's not that visible. But having said that, when people are desperate, in order to lead, people do take risk and can make those long distance international migration also. But there are not concrete evidence on that. Most evidence suggests that it's mostly internal or within the region.
So, Jakob, Amina was talking about that some of the reasons might be from mountain hazards or because the availability of water. And I remember back in 2015, I was in London, and I could the reason of the mountain hazard then, it was not the climate change, probably, you will probably maybe currently know that it was like a earthquake, but we could see how mountain hazards can really devastate complete villages or valleys, and what's the impact, the human impact of that, but also when we talk about infrastructures and villages, and it's it's something that here in Scandinavia we are seeing with more wetland movements that it's going to the sea, for example, or to lakes, or in the Alps we see more of the permafrost melting and big blocks of rock falling down. And what's the status of mountain hazards in Himalayas and in the Karakoram, because they are big mountains, big glaciers, big lakes, very long rivers, and it affects big populations. It's not one village under the mountain, but it's a lot of people living from the resources of those mountains.
No, exactly. So what you said in the very end, there are many people who depend on different resources actually of the mountains. And I think that also brings us to the point that is so crucial with those hazards. They can play havoc on many different aspects of your life. And they can have impacts in the long term, right? In the long run. So, for example, you mentioned the example of the earthquake in Nepal or in the Himalaya in 2015. That was especially devastating in the Langtang Valley. Now, earthquakes have always happened, right? They will always happen. It's unrelated to climate change. And this is it's always bad if it impacts people. Often a lot of people die. It doesn't matter whether they hit in Los Angeles, in Kathmandu or in Istanbul. But what the question is then, how resilient are populations to bounce back after these events, right? And what we do see with many of these hazards, especially, so for example, when you have earthquakes, but what has been following after the earthquake in 2015 have been increased landslides, right? Since then, because you can imagine that the mountain basically has been moving and it became unstable. Now, before 2015, there was also monsoon, there was also a lot of rain, but the mountain wasn't unstable enough to actually get these landslides moving. I mean, the landslides happened before, but not as many. What we really see has happened after the earthquake is that the amount of landslides has increased quite a lot. Now, what complicates that even further is that after the earthquake, something happened which we call build back better. So that's a terminology that they use in development, in the development world, right? To say, okay, we quickly have to put infrastructure in again after a disaster, which in principle is not a bad thing. But what it also does is there has been an explosion of road construction after the earthquake. Also because in general, of course, there is an interest to put more infrastructure in mountains. So you have both things. You have the monsoons, you have the instability because of the earthquake. So this very initial force, which is very, very strong. And then on top of that, you have more road constructions, and that has even further increased the landslides that came down. So since the earthquake, and that's now already quite a few years ago, we see an increase in these landslides. And that is concerning because that has been affecting the lives of people in that region for a very long time. And it's nearly impossible for them, like Amina was saying before, like people in villages, to kind of, to adapt to that. It's just getting more and more and more. So it's very, very challenging. And this is also, climate-related hazards. Avalanches have always been around, right? Even before climate change, we had avalanches, we had floods, we had all of that. But I think the scary aspect of climate change is that more of these events happen at the same time. So it kind of becomes this chaotic system. You have, you have landslides that happen on top of a lake, and then that creates that creates a flood. Or what happened, for example, in Langtang the year before, right, in 2014, there was this very, very strong typhoon that actually, it also impacted climbing in 2014 already, because the avalanche danger in that autumn was quite harsh. But that also meant that there was a lot of snow on the mountains already. So that on top increased also the mass of the avalanche that hit this village in Langtang especially, but also the base camp on Everest, right? Because on that same day, there was actually quite a massive avalanche there as well. So you have things coming together, and this makes it very uncomfortable for people who are directly at the basis of all that. But it also makes it uncomfortable for us as scientists, because before that, I would say, okay, if we have a landslide, we talk to an expert on landslides, he's going to deal with it. If we have a flood, we talk to an expert on floods, and he's going to deal with it. If you have glacial hazards, you talk to someone like me, and we'll talk about glacial hazards, right? This doesn't work anymore. We are beyond that point. Like, not everything, but many things are happening at the same time. And then also more, like, people are moving away from mountains, but they're also moving. They are, for example, they're moving more to urban spaces or semi-urban spaces. So they start to build up in mountains at the same time, right? Big roads are being constructed over the Himalaya because countries want to be connected. So you have higher exposure of this infrastructure. So actually you're moving towards the hazard. So you need to also talk to people who are experts on that. And that becomes very difficult because scientists normally, they are not very good in talking to people outside of their field. So this is a challenge for us. And this scares me beyond the avalanches. I've been in avalanches, and it's very, very scary, and I really don't like it. But what scares me beyond that, right, that meta level, is that we start it, and avalanches are already unpredictable. But if it becomes even more unpredictable, like in the future, that are we going to have a heat wave at the same time as strong precipitation? Is this going to increase or decrease the risk of avalanches? We don't really know. That is scary, because if people don't know what's going to happen, that makes every one of us uneasy, right? And this is what you see a lot in mountains and with hazards in these, like you said, extreme mountains of the Himalaya. Everything is bigger, right? The mountains are bigger, the rivers carry more water, there are more people. I mean, sometimes people don't even realize that in high mountain Asia. I had this recently with another scientist who said, no, but in Europe, like in the Alps, there are not more people. I was like, have you ever looked at the map how big high mountain Asia is? I mean, there are big cities on the Chinese side, right? In Tibet, they are at a very high elevation. There's a lot of many different societies. Yeah, so everything is bigger. So in a way, everything there also becomes more extreme. And the avalanches drop here in the mountains where we work. Sometimes they drop for 2,000 meters straight, right? You have these rock form, like you have the Serac Fall, where the hanging glacier just drops down. In the Alps, that is rarely possible because you simply don't have these continuous walls where it can drop directly. So yeah, that also makes it more picturesque in a way. It becomes more beautiful or more impressive to look at. But at the same time, it's also a bit concerning, of course, when we talk about hazards.
Yeah, no, that's crazy to think that, yeah, all these different hazards are coming at the same time, and probably some are unpredictable, like avalanches or like an earthquake. But yeah, as the glaciers are disappearing faster than that, probably that also means like it's less things holding on, like all the minerals, and probably I know, like in Europe and here in Scandinavia, like it's been studied like glaciers for very, very long, like with mountain monitoring. So how do you do like all the glaciology work there? It's also stations or like field work often done. And you were mentioning just before we started recording, like that Langtang actually is one of the places where the glaciology is the most studied. So can you tell us a bit about how how is the field work in the Himalayas, and how did it started there?
Yeah, it's a very important topic, I think, because I think there are two sides to the story. On the one hand side, there has been scientific interest from many different people for a long period, going back to the 19th century, right? And this is something that you mentioned before when you asked Amina about the Occidental view on high mountain Asia, right? For many years, we did not realize how many, how the people who live here have already been interested, of course, in their environments as long as they've been living here, right? They only did not document it perhaps in English, or they did not publish it in the journals that we read. But that doesn't mean that there has not been any investigation in what has been happening. And we are actually at the moment, we are at that point where we start to realize much more how much knowledge has already been around for a long time. For example, Langtang is, again, it's an interesting example because just last week I saw a map that was made in 1860, right? So that's now 170 years ago, and it had Langtang Peak, so Langtang Lirong Peak on that map, and the elevation of that on that map is about 8 meters off from what we know now how high it is, right? So already in 1860, they had a pretty good idea of that mountain and how high it was actually. And this was done, by people with very different means of what we have today. I mean, they had to travel on foot over distances that are crazy, with materials that were sometimes hidden in their clothes because it was politically also difficult, like it is today, but in a very different scale. So this is just to say that research has always been around. Now, the way we do monitoring with modern stations, right, what we call automatic stations, so a station that I put up on a glacier that monitors at all times, even when I'm not there, this really has only started in the 1970s in the Himalaya. But even that is already, it's a significant period of time, because normally when we talk about climate, we want to have time series of at least 30 years, right? Everything below 30 years doesn't really tell us much about climate change. But we are at the point in the Himalaya where we now do have some areas, and Langtang is one of them, where people have really been measuring since the 1970s. And that is, again, thanks to, in this case, Nepali, Japanese, and also Swiss scientists who long ago were fascinated by the mountains, also because of climbing. Many of these early scientists were also climbers. And they came there and they stayed for much longer than now we do nowadays. Right? Nowadays, I go into the field, after 3 weeks, I leave again. There is a famous Swiss scientist who stayed the whole winter on Khumbu ice, like Khumbu Glacier. And he has, in the 1930s, 40s, and he has recorded absolutely incredible data because he was there for so long. But nowadays, so only since about, let's say, 10, 15 years do we have the most modern setups that are really comparable to the way we also monitor climate and snow and in Europe or in North America. So we in Langtang, for example, we try to measure as much as possible because it's been done for so long. So this helps us because we have long time series of change and we have a history of what has been happening. So the stations there are measuring, the usual temperature, rainfall, snowfall, and in more recent past, we're also interested in how snow is changing, especially because that is really something we haven't investigated so much as we perhaps should have. There was a lot of focus on glacier ice, but not enough on snow, and snow is much more difficult to measure because every year it comes and goes, right? Glaciers, they stay around for much longer. And snow is also changing, and actually that's also very worrying. So we do have stations all over across the valley to try to understand how these parts of the cryosphere are contributing to water, for example. Also how they contribute to the water available for the people who live in the valley. But then also we use this to make large-scale models that allow us then to have an understanding of how much water will be available much further downstream. The big difference perhaps to the Alps is, again, in what we discussed before. Everything is bigger, and that means that it's much harder to get to some places to put up stations, right? So everything is higher. We have stations going up to 6,000 meters, and at above that, even at that elevation, you can only have flying stations in the Alps, right? So it's physically more demanding. You need to be able to work at altitude and these kind of things. It's also it's colder in winter, so our stations generally, often when we get stations made by European scientists, they will say, "Oh, it's fine for the winter," and we'll tell them, "No, it's not going to be fine. They need to be better than that." And then we put them out, and then indeed after half a year they are broken, so we need to fix them again, which is similar to the work we also do in Greenland, right in the Arctic. It's so extreme everything. And the distances are, yourself, you've been traveling in the region and running or walking, but sometimes we also have to run because we have to get somewhere fast. But you have to walk for quite a while until to get to, kind of your base camp. And then your base camp is just your base camp. So you need to get your first camp and the second camp. And then you have to we always have a big team of porters and guides with us, because we need safety as well. We need food. We work in the field for a long time. But also because they help us and they do a lot of the science actually with us. They look at the change and they also care in a different way because they are from there, like, not perhaps from the same valley, but from another valley just very close. And so they are curious what is happening themselves, which is actually a great part of the field work, because I'm not from the Himalaya, but I'm from another mountain chain, so I care about mountains. But they of course have a different emotional attachment, which makes it great for us to exchange and to work on that. I bring the expertise on the science and on the technical, on how to install a weather station, and they bring the expertise on what they have been seeing their whole life, because 20 years or 30 years ago I was not around, but their parents and their grandparents were. So this collaboration with the people, not just in Nepal, but also in other countries of the region, is important also as a climate scientist. It informs the research we do. Apart from that, the technology is the same as we would use in Europe. And we are collaborating a lot with people in Switzerland and Norway as well, actually, on certain topics, because they are interested in what is happening. They have their own projects that they are funding, and so because we have our scientific network that we constantly exchange with, for them it's another interesting place to work in and to compare to. So this constant exchange between people from other mountain regions is very helpful and important, I think. Yeah.
Can I just add to that, Kilian? I think that's a very valuable point that Jakob mentioned. What often the scientific community does not realize and does not probably respect so much is the local knowledge system. And we are talking about decades or centuries of knowledge, right? So when you have to live so closely with the nature, when your very life is dependent on the nature, then you observe. So one fascinating, since you mentioned about Langtang, so first time in Langtang, and then I was also presenting what we were doing, what we have found. So there's pictures about melting glaciers, and they were all like, yeah, but that's something, for them it's a general knowledge, because they have seen that, the glaciers used to be till Kenzingompa, and now it has shifted around 2 kilometers far. That's something they have seen it, right? So, and what was so fascinating was they were not really worried about glaciers, particularly in Langtang. They said for next 2 generations we have. By the time we run out of water, the rest of the world would be completely parsed, so that's not our worry. And that's where they then said that what we need to know more is snowfall, because that completely matters to us, because our agriculture, our mountaineering, trekking, as well as this livestock completely depends on that snowfall patterns. And this is where I think you really knowing the communities, taking communities' knowledge, so really using this blended knowledge system becomes very, very important. Because yes, Langtang, long history, but there are so many other places where we don't know, right? So how do you bridge that knowledge gap? Because it's not going to be possible to have those observatories everywhere else. And this is where I think more innovative thinking becomes very important. So something I just wanted to add.
Yeah. No, and when Jakob was talking about not only the impact in the glaciers, but also of course the snow, and it comes down to water. Probably for the populations, maybe the populations that they are living up in the valleys, they are more worried about this hazards of like landslides, avalanches, but like the water that it's providing these mountains, it goes all the way down to not only all Nepal but all the I can think about India and all these countries. So like it's almost like 2 billion people that probably lives around this area that it's somehow alimentated by the Hindu Kush water, and like it's it's a change on the resources, and I'm thinking more on like agriculture and how the families or the industry are facing like crop loss or like failure on some agricultural systems. Have you seen something about that?
Absolutely. So actually, in the Hindu Kush Himalayan region, the region itself has 240 million people, but another 1.65 billion people depend on those resources. So because it is, this is the source for 10 major river basins in Asia. So, that water availability is going to have a huge impact on the whole agriculture sector, and in turn, food and nutrition security. So in HKS region itself, people are already very, very concerned. So one of our study sites, this is not mentioned in our report, but one of our study sites in Ladakh in India, they were already concerned. They were saying that in next 20 years, we are going to run out of water because they can see the glaciers receding, and they realize that with the pace that it has been receding, it remains for next 20 years. After that, it's gone. And they are already thinking of what could be the alternative. So that futures, they already see that futures, how are they going to have a life without those glaciers? Is it possible to have different source of water? So that thought process is already there. So people are very, very aware. The closer to the mountains, of course, directly you are, depending on snowfall and glaciers. So the impact becomes that much more evident. The farther away you go, then it becomes more complex. Now, explaining that complexity is Jakob's job, because then again, the rainfall, monsoons, everything comes into play, right? But even if you don't go that far, you can already see the impacts in the HKH region. Now, this is again where, as compared to the European and other regions, for instance, like there are very limited literature. What does it mean for tourism sector? Because this region does attract a lot of tourism, and be it mountaineering or trekking and hiking. What does it mean? So that kind of studies have been limited. So far, most of the studies have focused on agriculture, crop, livestock, and which is very important because that's the bread and butter for the people here. But tourism per se has very little to do. And what is missing at the moment is, so you started this conversation saying that if this present level of or higher emissions happen by 2100, most likely up to 80% of the glaciers would be gone. What we don't know is what does it mean for the livelihoods and economy of the people. So when you make those kind of projections, what kind of futures are we talking about? So these are the knowledge gaps. So what happened, because we don't know it, and we have been largely left people to deal with the changes themselves. So what people do is, what changes are happening and then adapting to those changes. What's going to be very, very important moving forward is anticipating those changes. Okay, if, in next 5 or 10 years, how much percentage of glaciers are going to melt, then, okay, what are those consequences for the people's life and livelihoods, and what actions can be taken? Because if we don't do that, then, what I call it as extreme scenario where you can't live in the village anymore and have to move out. Because for people, living in the mountains, that would be an extreme case where they have to leave everything that they know and move to a new place. You mentioned about Lantern. Even after such a massive disaster where then the government of Nepal actually said that this is not habitable anymore, but people still went back because, where do people go? So they understand the risk, But then you don't have really options. So people are now back. People have started to rebuild. The last time I visited, apparently everybody has now been there, new houses and now settled there. So, adaptation becomes critically important, and even for that, very, very important to understand the impacts now and impacts in the future so that we can plan for that.
Yeah, exactly. Adaptation, it's key because like you mentioned the change, like even with we are like setting the goal like of 1.5 or like 2 degrees, like that's being optimistic seeing the current trends, but it will be changed. It's not that if we stop like emitting today, it will stop the trend tomorrow. Like we will need to make some adaptations everywhere in the world and in the Indicus, in more probably because like it's the changes started before, so it will take longer, and like in all the aspects as you mentioned, like in of course agriculture and like the tourism and is not, if the adaptations are in place, then it's like people will need to do like migrations to find like either resources or places to live. And like for me, I have been coming to Nepal like for the past like 10 years, and already in that like I could see the change like on the mountains, and like the glaciers like everywhere, like we see like every year it's getting like smaller, but I think it's also like linked to what Jakob said, like to see like that the weather predictions are harder, and like the seasons predictions are harder. Like maybe 10 years ago you say, okay, if I come to Nepal at this time of the year, I know that the temperature will be like that, the weather will be like that, and you could have like more of a plan. And now it's like just like you don't know, like you don't know if that would be like too hot to climb in the glaciers, that it will be melting already, or if it will be like big snowfalls. And it's I think that's changing a lot. And for like tourism, like it's I think now like people will need to adapt to that, but also I can think that for people living there, like it's this change is change also like on how they are planting, like on the like the food they are growing, that it's changing, like how these cycles are going. So we see these big changes. I could see that as a tourist, like coming there, but I'm talking with people in the valleys. They say that it's impacting already the tourism, and it's impacting already the agriculture of their small gardens, but like probably in bigger places more. And where you are talking a lot about like the resilience and the actions of the people, and is there like something like like people power comes to a point, and it's governments also, like in all the area, like not only Nepal but also like Pakistan, India, China. Do you also see that it's kind of a priority for them, or it's not that yet? Like I see in Europe, like it's like a lot of talk on climate change, but it's not yet a priority. Like when you talk about actions, do we see more focus on the solutions in these areas, or not yet?
I would say mixed. Governments do realize, because this last 5-6 years we had this very, as Jakob was saying, very scary events, mixed hazards that none of us had previously thought about, and that does make governments very cautious. So Pakistan, the floods with 1/3 or more of the country underwater. So obviously government is very, very aware. Similarly in Nepal, like I think 2 years back, we had heavy rainfalls during harvest season of the maize crop, paddy crop. So, when you look into all these losses, it's not like the government is not aware. Government is aware. Is it a priority? I would say yes, but of course there are also other developmental things going on, right? So it gets all mixed up sometimes. I think there are two things to consider. Even if the governments are aware and it's a priority, how much capacity do they have in terms of human resources like technology and others, as well as in terms of financial resources. So this is where the major problem happens. So what happens is, climate change, if we are talking about, as I said, glacier melt, it is not impacting equally everywhere else. If we are talking about temperature increases, these impacts are so localized, and the adaptation needs are also very localized. Now, this is that's another level of challenge in the mountain because of the topography, the microclimatic conditions are so diverse. And this is where local adaptation needs has to be addressed. And having an institutional mechanism to do that is a challenge at the moment. Secondly, funds. There are simply not sufficient funds to meet the adaptation needs. And internationally, if you look into the commitments for, funds in adaptation, that has not really realized. And this is where, the governments face challenges. They have their own internal institutional, mechanism that is not really suitable. That is one level of challenge. For instance, a lot of, mandates is given to local governments, and also for local people, it's easier to access my own local government than somebody sitting in, capital of the country. But then local governments have so little capacity. So, funds, capacity, all this then becomes challenges collectively. And this is where it's not like governments don't want to do it. Probably, despite wanting to do it, not having those institutional systems and then resources and technical capacity is where, I see a major chunk of challenge. And as I said, even impact-wise, we really don't have so much. So macro level, yes, we understand it will have impact on crop productivity, but then looking into, more, because as a farmer, I'm interested in my, my life, right? But then having those kind of information at local level is still missing largely. So there are these number of challenges that we can foresee. Now, you mentioned about tourism. Just the other day, I was speaking to a tour operator, and they were saying that it has become so difficult to predict any season. And obviously, tourists come paying so much of money to see the Himalayas, and it happens that the whole week you can't see anything else. And they were saying that we have now started to put a disclaimer that, okay, this is the season for trekking, for mountain views, but then we cannot guarantee, as, saving themselves. So these are all, problems that people are facing, and more needs to be done in terms of adaptation. We understand the problem now, but then we need to invest more in terms of durable solutions. And this is where I think we need to move ahead.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and probably we are thinking about or talking about what are the adaptations these countries, these people are doing locally, or the local governments or the governments of these countries. But we shouldn't forget that the problems that are happening because climate change in these countries are mostly, or almost not because the lifestyle of these countries or the missions of these countries, but it's because the missions of the Western countries of Europe, US, that it has been gone for decades. The effects of this climate change is not happening in Europe or in America, but it's happening in those countries. So it's not that because the effects of climate change are more severe in Nepal, in the Himalayas, that is the fault of those countries, but the opposite. It's not because we don't see the effects here in Europe, or now we started just to see it, but it's not because we are seeing later that this climate change isn't really affecting the lives of all these countries that have on the historical had way less emissions. And talking about where all this is going in terms of the glaciers and the water, Jakob, what are the provisions? What are the we mentioned a bit that on the current term, you are having like a provision that the 80% of the glacier's volume will be gone on 2100. But yeah, can you go more about a bit in detail on that? Like how do you see the future in terms of like glaciers in waters in the Kush?
So, like anywhere else, like in other mountain regions, like in the Alps, it's going to reduce. How fast and when they will all be gone is, up to scientific debate and up to these usual uncertainties that are always a bit annoying for the general public when we even talk about them, because we are never 100% sure what will happen in future. But so the ice will, in some parts of the globe, ice will disappear completely, right? In the Himalaya, in the region here, it's a little bit different because the glaciers are so big. They're so thick, like the ice below, so the ice that you cannot see, it goes down so deep that, hypothetically, if we would change our behavior tomorrow, there is actually hope for them to remain and to even bounce back, right? So this is a difference if you compare it to the Alps, for example. Most of the glaciers in the Alps, we have passed the point of no return, right? So even if we do everything tomorrow, if we start doing everything right from tomorrow, it's too late. And I think it is important to also mention that we have to acknowledge. It's always difficult, and also in activism, also and in outreach, how positive or negative are you, right? And we saw this with the new IPCC panel. So a few days ago, the new head of the IPCC was appointed, and he was interviewed, and he said, 1.5 degrees does not mean that the world will go down. And I'm pretty sure he did not mean to say don't worry about it, but there is a difference between saying we are all going to die and everything's going to be fine. We don't have to do anything, right? There's a lot of space in between, and there is a lot of space where if we make only small changes, it will make life easier in the future. And so that for the region here, for the ice here, if we do change our behavior, there is hope that ice will actually, it will be around in future, and that can have huge consequences, not just for the region, but also globally. People in Europe should care about the ice here, because the ice, like the mountains here, are so big, they actually influence the global climate, right? So the problems are coming home to roost. It's going to bite you if you think that the climate change is only, like we say now in Europe, it only affects Greece. People in Greece, they have a problem, but up in in Germany or in Scandinavia, we are fine. No, that's not how it's going to be. So in the Himalaya, there is still hope for that, but yes, it's going to change drastically, which means that what we are expecting in the future, that actually there will be more water available, right? Because glaciers are melting increasingly, so we are reaching a point where actually rivers are producing more water. That has positive and negative aspects, right? It can be great for agriculture, it can be great for hydropower production, but it also means that the baseline for floods, for example, is much higher. It means that erosion gets higher, right? So we have now already farmers that have their land, and they cannot choose because they always live there, that have their land close to a river. They see that land disappear. And I have talked to so many farmers in the region who are devastated by these long-term assets, right? Their land is just like 1 year they have this much of rice paddies, and the next year they have half of it, and they cannot sustain their family with that anymore. So this additional water has positive and negative aspects, but then eventually we'll hit the point where it will go down, right? When those glaciers have receded so far that they move up to the high parts, they don't melt so much anymore. If then also snow is not that much, so there's not that much snow melt anymore, then we are more dependent on rainfall, and rainfall is much more erratic, which again, what we discussed about before, that's why depending only on rainfall is so annoying, right? Because we can we can forecast it, but we cannot predict it and so accurately, and that is uncomfortable, right? As a farmer, you want to rely on, and also as industry, you want to rely on what is happening next year and when it happens. And with rains, that's hard. With meltwater, it continuously comes, so that's great. So if that disappears, that we have a problem, right? The water is not coming evenly anymore. It's also important to communicate. So people, for example, they would always, or even when I talk to school kids, they would say, oh, if all the glaciers are gone, does it mean that the water is gone? Is it all dry? No. Within the planet, we are like these snowballs. The water stays within that planet. The problem is, where is it? If it's in the ocean, and if it's salt water, I don't want to drink that. If it comes, if all the water comes in June, and I don't have any water in winter or the other way around, then that's also a problem. So we have to be very careful in what we wish for, and even if the water will be there, but it will come at points in time where it's not so useful anymore. And that is a problem, because plants will only grow a certain time of the year. They don't care. If the water is not there anymore, they will say, okay, I'm out of here. No, this is too dry for us at the period of time where we have enough temperature to actually grow. So then we are running into troubles. And we are seeing this, like Amina was saying in the duck, we are seeing this now already in some high parts of the mountains. The water is not there anymore at the time when it's needed for agriculture. So it's getting dry. We're having like drought situations at elevations. I just came back from an area that's located next to one of the biggest rivers in the world, the Indus. And we have drought situations next to a river that carries so much water. Like you would think, how is that possible? But the water is all in the river. I need it up on my field, right? I cannot do anything with millions of cubic or thousands of cubic meters rushing past. I cannot just go there and, put in a hose and pump it up. I need energy for that. It needs money. It needs investment. That's what we call adaptation, right? And that's what Amina was saying. There is not readily so much money around for that adaptation. So we are at the situation already where people have to invest in situations where the water is there when they don't need it, and it comes it doesn't come at a time when they actually do need it, which then also creates problems between countries, because we start to retain water, right, with hydropower. So we are now able to create dams that keep water back. So it's useful for one thing, but perhaps not for the other. Hydropower has a very different need than agriculture. So as this melt is going to be less, so we expect that happening heavily in the second half of the 20th century. We are much more at the mercy of erratic patterns of water, and that's really not great. So this is, I think, the biggest concern. And with snow, we don't know so much. So snow we suspect now it's also going to decrease, but it's also going to fall in much more intense manner. So we're going to have more high intensity snowfall events, which means possibly, it's not really clear, but it could mean that there are more avalanches. But it also means that there is snowfall in seasons when it's really bad for animals and plants, right? There are still, also in the Alps, many people who rely on agriculture, and they rely on, the high pastures to be cultivable for and livable for animals. And if it gets too cold, and if you have these blizzards in the summer, your animals die. And the cow is not just cute; it's also really expensive. It's also sheep, really expensive in Europe as well, right? So it's bad for a farmer if they lose only a few of them. It can then link to what you said before, that eventually farmers decide to look for a different job because they cannot rely on that income anymore. And if they have to look for a different job, that often then pushes them also to move somewhere else, because up in the villages, that's more or less all you can do. You either go to tourism or you move. And tourism, like rainfall, you cannot always have it. And we saw that especially the last couple of years, right? In Nepal, there was the earthquake, and then after the earthquake, tourism bounced back, and people invested millions in their houses, and they were saying, oh, now everything's going to be great. And then COVID came. Who knows what's going to happen in future? It's not very reliable. And locals are taking huge risks to invest in something that's not reliable, which, in Langtang, people never ask me for money. All these years that I've worked, I'm working in Langtang now since 11 years, and never has any one of the locals gone to me and said, would you have I need something for it, which normally you can ask friends, right? And we are friends with the people who live there. But now after COVID, people have started to ask, not because they are really poor, but because they invested all their money in these huge houses, which they expected to reap profit in future. And now they are in debt with the banks. So suddenly you have a bank that popped up actually in Langtang in the highest village, right? And it's giving out mortgages for people. Livelihoods are changing at a really fast pace. So it's again also there. It's not just the hazards. It's also this is becoming money streams and access to money becomes very different also in mountains, which then exposes you to different risks than you would be would be used to a few years ago. So that adds on top of our water's changing, I think.
Yeah, it's a lot of changes, as you mentioned, like on ice, water, on livelihoods, on the lives of people. And but one thing that you say that I would like to finish with is you mentioned hope, and I think with Amina, what you have been saying about resilience, about adaptations, there is hope. But for the last message, what would you say, like to people like me that might be like traveling to the Hindu Kush for tourism or for climbing, or for people that they are like just thinking about like what are the implications of climate change all around the world? What's your recommendations? What do you think that they should do or like or think to be able to keep this hope and to change the trend?
Thank you, Kilian. That's going to be super good last message. I think, see, people live in hope, and the whole resilience that you see in Himalayas is because people still have hope of continuing living where they call home, right? For that to be possible, I think it's very important that all of us take this message of supporting what you said. This is a global challenge brought on by global emissions, where Hindu Kush Himalaya regions, even if it is, we have, India and China, part of that is in HKS, but if you look at the region, the contribution in emission is negligible. But then when you talk about impacts and loss and damage that they have to, bear, it's massive, and that's not fair. So, having more resources invested here so that people can continue to live with these changes. Now, this unending emissions, it's simply not possible. That's the path to collective destruction. So emissions has to come down. So mitigation is important, but also equally important that there is investment done for adaptive capacities. We don't leave the vulnerable population to deal with this, mess that the global community has made. It's simply not just to leave them on their own. Because if they are to live with hope, then that support, international support, will be very, very critical. And that support has to reach the communities. Because without that, how long can you live only on hope? Because at one point, then that chills into hopelessness. And another message, I think, for the global community. Now, Kilian, you as adventure sports person, you go to these places and you have seen that changes. As a person working in this region, and also as a person, I'm from Nepal, so, I have seen those changes. But even 10 years back, you and me would probably still think that climate change is not really that important. Now, it's important for me because I'm not a farmer, but then dengue, every year now I have to worry about dengue, right? So the climate change has come to bite me. And similarly, every one of us is going to have this. So it's just a matter of time before, wherever you are going to be impacted. So why go through that process? So two things, amplify that voices for mitigation so that emissions are really reduced, lifestyle changes and all of that. Second, for those who are already being impacted, support, international support in terms of financial as well as technical, so that they can hope to continue to live where they live. I think that's the message that I would like to. And here, maybe I should mention, this is the right moment, where ICIMOD has started a campaign. So, basically anybody else who have experienced these impacts of changes in snow or ice, they can write their stories in any of the social media that of their interest with hashtag Save Our Snows, because that would also help amplify. It's not only a bunch of scientists talking nonsense, but to really understand that this is actually widespread. So that would be another request from my side. Thank you so much, Kilian.
Yeah, wonderful way to finish the conversation. So, Amina, Jacob, thank you for your time, for sharing your knowledge, and hope we keep in contact to see how this wonderful part of the world is evolving, and that we can all together bring more resources, to have more resilience, and to change the trends that it's of what's happening. Thank you very much for your time, and everyone listening. Thanks for being here too.